Hey everybody. Well, we've learnt lots about how natural selection actually works, but now we're going to look at who came up with the idea. Because like any scientific discovery, and particularly when we're talking about a theory, because remember, theories in science are a really broad explanation that explains lots of different observations about the world. They're not just a single hypothesis. They cover lots and lots of different concepts. So theories develop over time, bit by bit. Of course, some people make the big breakthrough, but it's all based on the work that people before them did, and scientists build on who came before them. You might hear the phrase, standing in the shoes of giants, which that's what basically every scientist is doing. People before them have made discoveries. If you're a scientist, you'll learn what they learnt, you'll base your work on what they did, and you'll take it a little bit further to make new breakthroughs. Okay, so we'll look at a really brief timeline of how the theory of natural selection came about. Starting way back in the 1700s, all the way up to the modern day, which we now call the modern synthesis, which is the modern understanding of how evolution happens. Okay, so our story starts back in the 1790s, where there was a Scottish scientist called James Hutton. His big breakthroughs weren't actually in biology at all, they were in geology and fossils. So he came up with a lot of the ways we understand processes in the earth to happen, like the way rocks form, the way volcanoes work, the way tectonic plates move, and the fact that fossils get buried beneath layers of rock that's younger and younger and younger as you get higher up. So after his work, that was really important because people started to realize that actually the world can't be as young as it's said in the Bible, where it started with Adam and Eve, that we're starting to find fossils of species that don't exist anymore, and they must have existed millions of years ago, if all these geological processes are correct, which they've been shown to be. So that was the first step in the way we thought of the evolution of the Earth. The next person that came along was this French scientist here. His name was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And his breakthrough came in about 1800. He actually came up with a theory that turned out to be wrong. And this happens in science a lot. So his theory was actually called acquired inheritance. Acquired inheritance. So he thought that species would actually evolve just in their lifetime. So the classic example of acquired inheritance is giraffes, where giraffes originally had shorter necks. We know their ancestors did. They looked a lot more like horses. But as each individual giraffe strained its neck during its lifetime to try and reach the tall branches, then its neck would grow during its lifetime. And that means it would pass on its longer neck to its children, and then those children would stretch their necks over their lifetime, and species would evolve that way. So that theory survived for quite a few decades, actually. It wasn't until the 1840s and 1850s and this is where we meet our most famous characters who we saw earlier. We've got Alfred Russel Wallace and we've got Charles Darwin. So it wasn't until then where they came up with the idea of natural selection. So they'd been studying living things. They both travelled around the world, looked at lots of different ecosystems, made really good observations, and they started to realise that species couldn't change within their life. You can't gain a trait that you need just because you need it. And they came up with the way we understand natural selection today. So here's the example with giraffes again. It wasn't the fact that the necks grew during each generation, it's the fact that each generation of giraffes, they've got different size necks. And over time, the ones with the longest necks are going to survive, and the ones with the shortest necks are not going to be able to survive, and they'll die off, leaving the ones with the longer necks to pass on their genes. So natural selection was the big breakthrough. But Wallace and Darwin, they didn't talk about how traits get passed on to the next generation. They weren't focused on genetics at all. And so it took geneticists to combine the idea of how genes work with evolution. And so that started with Grigor Mendel. And it's in 1860 when he did his work. So we met Grigor Mendel when we were learning about genetics. He did lots of experiments breeding pea plants. And he came up with the idea that genes are individual units that get passed on, and they carry an allele. Well, there's different forms of genes, which are alleles. And that these alleles control the phenotypes and the traits that you have. So no one really realized how important his work was, and it wasn't even discovered again until the 20th century, in the 1900s. So after his work was discovered, scientists started to realize that, hang on, genes must be how individuals are passing on these traits to their children. So in the early 1900s all the way to the 1940s, lots of geneticists did more work. They discovered the structure of DNA and chromosomes. They learnt about meiosis and how mutations cause different alleles. And so all the work of all these people combined natural selection with Mendel's idea of genetics, and that's led to our modern day understanding of evolution. So the best way of thinking about how we understand evolution today is that it's a natural selection added to what we understand about inheritance.